Ladies and gentlemen, we felt it would be interesting and appropriate to share some conversations that I and John Daniszewski, Vice President of the Board and Vice President of the Associated Press, have had with some of our recent winners. And we're starting with Uliana Pavlova, who won in 2017. And now it's 5 years later, and she is a seasoned war correspondent. But before we get into Ukraine and Russia, tell us about your path from after you won. You had a number of internships and you worked for the Moscow Times. So how did you put together your career path?
Right. Well, thank you for inviting me. First of all, it's always a pleasure to talk. So I was a recipient in 2017, and I believe after that, I won an award for a story I actually did during one of my first internship with Political Europe in Brussels. And after that, I believe I did an internship with Bloomberg in Chicago, and then another one with CNN in Washington, D.C. And following that, I actually stayed in Washington, D.C. for another year and a half. And I worked as a junior reporter at this company called MLEX. I was doing policy reporting. So it didn't actually have to do anything with international news, but because I was Russian, I always had this goal to come back to Russia and cover Russia for the Western audiences. So in 2020, the pandemic started, and it just worked out this way that my visa was also ending and I had no way to renew it. So it seemed like a perfect time to fulfill my wish. And I went back to Russia. I moved to Moscow. I'm not originally from Moscow, so I didn't actually have any connections in Moscow per se, but I freelanced a little bit for Bloomberg Tax, and then I ended up being hired as a news reporter for the Moscow Times. And I worked there for a year. Mm-hmm. And then I went freelancing, and I started freelancing for several outlets in Moscow, including CNN, but also I was producing for CNN and Sky News, and also writing for the Associated Press and the Telegraph. It's a British newspaper. And I also did a few magazine stories for Political Magazine.
So how did you end up covering Ukraine, the crisis in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine?
Well, I'm also Russian Ukrainian. My mother is from Western Ukraine, and growing up, I actually spent a lot of time in Ukraine. I speak Russian and Ukrainian. Unfortunately, right now, I'm not able to go to Ukraine because I do have a Russian passport. But when the war started, I was actually at the border of Russia and Ukraine. And I was covering the war from the Russian side, which is actually interesting because I don't think there were a lot of people covering it from the Russian side just when it started. But it was a surreal experience because me and my team, we arrived to Belgorod at 5 a.m. on February 24th. And just at 5 a.m. on February 24th, the war started, and we could hear the jets flying. And then, the next thing you see the missiles in the sky. And Belgorod is a small military town. We had to go through several checks on the way there, which I also thought was a little bit weird. Because I think in a normal scenario, you wouldn't be stopped by border police so often. And, it is funny because it's not funny, but now thinking of it, we were driving to Belgorod and we got stopped by border security, and they checked our passports. They're like, "Oh, are you going to cover the war?" And it seemed like it was already, people already knew it was going to happen. And and it was interesting.
War, or did they use the word limited or special military operation? What words did they use?
They used the word war because back then it wasn't a law to call it special military operation. But now it is. Now we're all supposed to call it the special military operation, at least if you're in Russia, which I'm not. So I'm using the words war and invasion for what it is. And yeah.
Oh, I was just wondering, because you're Russian-Ukrainian background, do you feel any sense of being pulled in different directions when you cover this conflict?
Definitely. And that's something I actually did want to talk about, because at some point I began to envy my colleagues who were just foreign correspondents and people who were covering this from a more distanced perspective, when it felt like I was covering the story that was also happening to me. And the day the war started, my relatives started calling me. And, I had relatives from Ukraine who called me, and they were like, we can hear jets flying overhead. And, just it was a very stressful time because we didn't really know what would happen next. I find myself relatively lucky because my family is in Western Ukraine, which was relatively safe. But even in the first hours of the war, they had an airport that was just Russian troops bombed the airport there. And I felt like also it was interesting to see how different people in my family reacted to the war. And I think what is actually maybe sometimes not conveyed enough is that there's so many families like mine who are Russian, Ukrainian, and the war is doing really terrible things to these families, because now there is this drift. And, a lot of Ukrainians actually now do hate Russians for a reason, but also because there's such a widespread propaganda campaign inside Russia. Some people who live in Russia who don't really have that connection, they actually don't know what's going on. Some of them truly believe there is a special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, that Ukraine was about to attack Russia, and if Russian troops didn't get involved, there could have been a war once Ukraine joined NATO. So, it is really interesting because now there is such a huge drift that didn't exist before. And, I remember growing up and going to Ukraine every summer, and it was the most natural thing in the world. And now I'm afraid, I don't know when will be the next time I would be able to even go to Ukraine with my Russian passport. And it just seems like this connection that so many people had has been ruined forever.
How is it possible that Putin could completely hermetically seal off the information space inside Russia? That's remarkable. That overnight, it seems like the Russians once were plugged into the world, the global discourse, what the Chinese call the global discourse, and by the next day it was gone. They're hermetically sealed.
Yeah, it did feel like the Iron Curtain just dropped really quickly. But when it comes to state propaganda, actually, it's been happening for a while. I think Putin had over 20 years in power, and he spent those 20 years building a very strict vertical of power. And the state propaganda has been prepping people for the past 10 years, even 8 years, ever since 2014 and when Maidan happened. And people now have lower access to information. Before, there was at least, some Russian language independent media like Echo Moskvy, which existed, since the 90s. And suddenly, once the war started, they had to close. And this is unprecedented, right? They've been around for 30 years or more. And then other outlets closed. And suddenly you can go to jail for up to 15 years for just calling it a war and an invasion. And you can see that in the first days of the war, there were actually widespread protests in Russia against the war. But now Russian government has been really successful in cracking down on those. And now we all realized that we thought we all knew what country we lived in. And suddenly everything we knew just disappeared, and Russia has started heading towards the direction of Iran and North Korea. And I think maybe sometimes people in the West don't appreciate just how quickly it happens. Because even for me, I was covering this story on the border, and a week later, I felt like I had to leave because it was no longer safe for me to be there and do my job.
How did you get out of the country?
I flew out and I flew to Turkey like a lot of other Russians.
Did you need a visa, or you could just go to Turkey?
That's the thing. A lot of people from Russia go to Turkey because you don't need a visa to go there, and you can stay for up to 90 days. And also a lot of Russians now go to other post-Soviet countries like Georgia or Armenia because of visa-free travel. And, now there's also a lot of Russians there, so it's not much of a language barrier. But yeah, it was it all happened really quickly. Like, I don't even remember packing up much, and I didn't know what to pack and when I will be back. I only had one suitcase. So it's something that happened so quickly. And,
You may not be able to go back to Russia or Ukraine.
That's what I'm trying to figure out. I'm still hopeful that maybe I will be able to go back soon. But I think the worse things go in Ukraine, the more, the stricter it becomes inside Russia. I think the Russian government has shown that they're not playing around, and Russia is also suffering really heavy losses in Ukraine that are not really being acknowledged. And a lot of Russian journalists left, and foreign journalists also left and had to relocate elsewhere for time being. I think right now everybody is kind of in the same boat. Nobody knows what will happen next, and people are just trying to cover the story, but it is difficult because how long can you cover Russia from outside of Russia?
Mm-hmm.
So,
wow. Uliana, do you feel that at some level, the Russian people have had such experience over the last century with, as you said, the Iron Curtain and Stalinism and government control of information. Do you feel Russians at some level realize they're being propagandized, and that some of these reports about death of Russian soldiers or atrocities will somehow filter through to the population over time?
So what I find, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this as well, is that there seems to be a divide, and I would maybe even make a comparison to the United States. Mm-hmm. People in more rural areas who are less educated, older people, they tend to watch state television most of the time. And then, younger people who live in big metropolitan areas in Moscow and St. Petersburg, who are middle class, well educated, they know what VPN is, they know what Telegram is, they can, get alternative information online and look for BBC. Even if the website is blocked, they can use VPN to access it. But it seems like there is a really high threshold right now to get that alternative information. So you have to be someone who's well plugged in already to know what is going on. And another issue that is happening right now is that people who do understand what's happening are the ones who are most scared right now. And I think, everybody is trying to see what they can do in this situation. And a lot of people have left, and those who stayed are just trying to, live their lives and not go crazy, because it is very unusual situation, and none of us have experienced it before, at least people of my generation, because we grew up in a relatively stable time. We didn't grow up in the Soviet Union. And, our parents and older generation, they seem to have an attitude of, well, we survived X, so we can survive Z. But I think younger people are actually more distressed by what is going on right now.
Wow, deeply moving. So stay in touch with us. If there's anything the OPC Foundation can do for you or the OPC, we would be delighted to assist you in any way we could. So
Okay,
thank you for your time today.
Yes, thank you.
Take
So,
care,
Chad-
Uliana. Stay in touch, please.
Thank you. Yes, of course.
Max, good morning or good afternoon in Istanbul. John and I are delighted to be with you virtually today to talk about the path that you've taken to get to Moscow for 10 years and the path from Moscow. So what year did you win one of our foundation scholarships?
It was 2012, so
Ah.
10 years ago.
And then did we place you in the AP bureau in Moscow? Is that how that
You
worked?
did, yeah.
Wow. And so one thing led to another, and now you've been the Financial Times bureau chief for how long?
I've been with the FD for 6 years, but I've only been the bureau chief for about the last 6 months.
Well, welcome to the fire.
I
So-
know, yeah.
So you had to leave everything in Moscow when you fled with your family to Latvia originally. So did you leave all your worldly possessions behind, or the majority of them?
We haven't pulled out of Russia yet. You know, we are still trying to work out exactly what this all means for us. And you know, specifically, there's this law on, you know, what they call, you know, fake news and discrediting the Russian armed forces, where you can face up to 15 years in prison for things like calling the war a war and reporting a version of events that differs in any way from what the Russian Defense Ministry says. So we and a number of other media outlets were trying to work out what this all means for us, but we are very much hoping to keep our bureau alive and to be back when we can.
So were you surprised that Putin launched this invasion, this war, or did you sense that it was coming, judging from his rhetoric?
It was kind of both. What was very strange was, you know, being a foreign correspondent, you kind of have your feet in two worlds. So, one is, you know, the place where you're reporting from, and the other one is, you know, the Western world in DC, Europe, and it was real cognitive dissonance, because it wasn't the first time in the last years in Russia where the picture that Western governments and media were painting of Russia was totally different to the impression you get on the ground. Almost no one, I can name about maybe 3 people I know in Russia, and this includes you know, not just people in and around the government, but people in the expert community, people in the opposition, businessmen, diplomats. They were all convinced there was some kind of a clever trick by Putin to get things that he wanted out of the West. And of course, you know, U.S. intelligence had such a dubious track record on things like this that no one believed it was true. Also, I think a lot of people they didn't want to believe it was true, because it's really such an epoch-defining moment. We're going to be dealing with the consequences of this for decades, whatever happens on a battlefield. And I think people didn't really want to know what was happening. But starting, I think towards the end of December, I had a few slightly scary conversations with people, and Russia started making these strange threats, you know, demanding negotiations in public on things that they weren't going to make any concessions on. You know, making these impossible ultimatums. It was clear that they had some sort of ulterior motive. We just didn't know what it was. And what was really remarkable is it turned out that most of the people, you know, working for Putin, even they didn't know exactly what he was going to do. And by, you know, as far as I know, you know, many of them were as surprised as we were when it finally happened.
John, you're a former Moscow correspondent. Why don't you take the lead in the questioning?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Max, from your perspective, when Putin published that 7,000 word essay last summer, did you feel that was his manifesto for going in, or were you among the skeptics who thought he would never do it?
I was a skeptic for a long time. Initially, I didn't even pay that much attention to it, because it had been just, you know, 8 years of real, you know, 7-8 years of stalemate. this really grinding, low intensity war where no one was really satisfied by the status quo, but the alternative was just unthinkable, which is war, which is what we're dealing with now. And it's a long and in many places quite boring if you've read all 5,000 words of it, which I have. Screed, I didn't really think that much of it until a few months later, when the troops are appearing on the border. There are warnings coming out of U.S. intelligence. It became clear this was a lot more serious, and it wasn't until then I started taking it seriously. And what was really worrying about that was, you start to realize that even in 2014, when he first invaded Ukraine, annexed Crimea, started the war in the Donbass, it was only really they would dig up the most fringe people on the Russian nationalist right who would suddenly get to go on state TV and say things like this, and then you had Putin himself saying it, and that was I think it's one thing just to have this rhetoric floating around, but it became clear that once he started backing it up with actions on the ground, that this wasn't just some sort of idle threat or something that he was exploiting cynically to achieve some sort of aim as he has in the past. It is obvious now that he really passionately believes all these things, and that was obviously very worrying.
So where does it go? You mentioned that this is going to play out for decades. It's going to be a long time before we really get any clarity. Is that what you seem to be suggesting?
Well, so Ukraine and some of Ukraine's Western supporters, they suspect that by May 9th, Victory Day, Putin wants to declare victory in some way, have a big parade on Red Square, like they always do, and so that's why they want to make as many gains on the ground now as they can, reach some sort of political sentiment. But even if you look at the peace process, the peace process as described by Zelensky, which is going to involve a referendum, constitutional changes, is going to take at least a year. And more importantly, I think the global balance of power of the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union has been completely upended. We are back into a world of great power conflict. The idea that globalization was going to flatten everything out and bring about the end of history, as some people call it, that age is absolutely over. The world is really divided over this. You have Ukraine and its mostly Western supporters against the likes of China and India, who have tacitly supported what Russia is doing, and at the very least not condemned it. Some countries in the Gulf states, and this is going to affect absolutely everything, because it's the first time that there have been sanctions of this magnitude against a country as important to the global economy as Russia. Russia is one of the world's biggest oil and gas producers, and Europe is going to have to find a way to end its energy dependency on Russia. Russia and Ukraine are two of the world's biggest wheat exporters. This is going to create a global food crisis. It essentially has already. We're right in the middle of what's supposed to be planting season, and in Ukraine, a lot of farmers can't do that right now. And it's completely ripped up the global order, which Russia has basically said. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, said this today, that one of the reasons they did this was because they wanted to end U.S. domination of the world as they see it. So I think whatever happens, we're going to be dealing with the after effects of this for a long time. This is the biggest land conflict in Europe since 1945.
The Chinese are trying to straddle, playing both sides in effect. What do you think where the red line would be for the Chinese if they were to supply semiconductors, if they were to supply military spare parts? What do you think would represent a step too far that would end their attempt to play a balancing act?
You'd have to ask someone who knows China better than me. I can't tell you that. But one thing I can say is that we're seeing some evidence that these Chinese companies that Russia is going to want to rely on a lot more. They don't want to fall under Western sanctions either. So even Huawei, which is already itself under U.S. sanctions, in the position to really become a very big part of Russia's telecommunications infrastructure, they've been scaling back their presence in Russia as well. It's emerged recently while they try to work out what to do. So this is it doesn't necessarily follow that even though there is this tacit Chinese support for what Russia is doing because China is a U.S. adversary, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are immediately going to become best friends with Russia.
Max, how challenging is it for you to be covering Russia from outside Russia by necessity right now? And do you have any sense of how Russians are digesting these events and where their heads are going to be?
It's obviously it's not easy because we're not there. You don't have that feeling on the ground. But firstly, hundreds of thousands of Russians, including a lot of our sources, have left the country. That's why I'm in Istanbul, because there are some Russians here who I need to meet. I've been interviewing them. That's a very big part of the story. There hasn't been an exodus of people from Russia like this in many years, and also, this is the 21st century. We have the internet. Even if Russia is making steps to essentially cut itself off from large parts of the global internet, you can still find people on the ground, and by and large, a lot of them will still talk to you. And this is something I think really in the pandemic that we all got pretty good at, because we weren't traveling, we were mostly sitting at home, but you're still covering this whole huge country. And I call people in the middle of nowhere in Siberia all the time, and you just learn how to track them down. That's part of the job. You can't be in 9 time zones at once.
And where do you think the Russian mentality is going with this, as John had just asked? Do you think the Russians will just simply endure the body bags coming home forever?
Well, I think you have to accept that firstly, it's natural for any times of conflict for there to be some sort of initial rally around the flag effect, and there are these polls that show absolutely stratospheric support for the war, which I think we have to be a little skeptical about, because firstly, in a authoritarian country in a war, are you going to tell someone you don't know over the phone in a poll that you're against it? Quite possibly not. And also you have to remember the fact that for 70-80% of people, their only source of news is Russian state TV, which is presenting this completely warped view of the conflict. There's indications that support is reasonably high, not as high as they might portray it officially, but certainly a lot of Russians do at the very least passively support the conflict. What we're seeing is there isn't really that much active support for it. In 2014 with Crimea, there really was this big outpouring of patriotic sentiment, because it was something that was very, very dear to many Russians. The feeling that they'd had Crimea taken away from them. But this is obviously a harder sell, which is why Russia has been minimizing the scale of the destruction this caused and the casualties it has suffered itself. And I think the real question is this something that Russia, they quite clearly thought they could wrap this up in a few days. If this ends in a couple months, will and they can spin it as a victory. Will that work, or will the lasting economic damage and the growing casualties become more of a problem as those things start to be more noticeable? The one issue is something we've seen over the past 8 years of sanctions ever since Crimea, is that they don't have the effect that a lot of people in policy circles in the US and Europe hope that they would have, which is that Russia would say, oh, yes, these sanctions are bad, Putin, you have to go stop the war, because at the end of the day, Putin isn't the one who introduced the sanctions, it's the West. So a lot of people, not just in the elite, but ordinary people, they interpret this as hostile actions taken against them by the West. If you watch the discussions on state TV about sanctions, that's very much how they're portrayed. It's especially the really broad economic sanctions recently. The state TV presenters will say things like, these sanctions, they aren't against Putin, they aren't against officials, they aren't against oligarchs, they're against you, the ordinary person, just because you're Russian and the West hates you. And that's quite a powerful message.
Wow. John, a parting question?
Well, I mean, I really appreciated your writings during this period, and just would like to ask you where you think the arc of the story is, or what are you going to focus on in the coming months?
I think it's way too early to tell because we are, I don't think it's really helpful or appropriate to try to find some sort of paradigm to compare it to other to the Bosnian War or any other points of reference that we have, because we really are living in a new era here, and ultimately the decision how far Russia is going to go, that's all up to one man, and as we've seen, he isn't exactly hanging out with too many people in person. If they do, they're sitting at the end of a very long table. So we are obviously trying to follow what it's like in Russia as best we can. Very much think about Russia is it's an enormous country. It's 140 million people plus. It's in this day and age, even with all the restrictions they have, you can't turn a place like that into North Korea. Information is always going to get out. I think we're past the days of criminology, looking at the different positions of the Politburo members on Lenin's tomb to try to work out who's up, who's down. So we are going to be tracking what happens to Russian society. I think the impact of the sanctions, this is also something totally new, that's never really been done before like this. This is going to have impact, well beyond Russia that we're already seeing. What is this going to do to the primacy of the dollar worldwide as a settlement currency? What is this going to do to energy markets? We still have to find that out. And obviously we're very concerned with what's happening, first and foremost in Ukraine. It's just really astonishing to someone who's lived in Ukraine to see. I have friends there. It's you got to see what those people are going through day by day.
Well, Max, you're one of our stars. We're delighted you took the time out today to speak with us, and so best of luck to you, and stay in touch with us, and we believe in you.
Thanks a lot. That's very good.
Very true. Very true. Well done.
Valerie, tell us the quick trajectory, the quick story of how you went from being an OPC Foundation winner to being a war correspondent for the New York Times, covering the planet's biggest story.
Wow. Well, I graduated from Columbia in 2013 and was lucky enough to become an OPC fellow. And oh, sorry, maybe I'll start again. I don't know. Sorry. I mean, the trajectory. Yeah. So I graduated from Columbia in 2013 and was lucky enough to get a fellowship to go and work in the Balkans, actually with Reuters in their Belgrade bureau. And after my time at Reuters finished, I actually continued to work in the Balkans. I spent 4 years then in Kosovo, and then I continued to cover the region for the Financial Times. I was based out of Budapest, but I was covering Hungary, Romania, Albania, Bulgaria, and the whole former Yugoslavia, where I had previously lived also before my time at Columbia. And yeah, it was a great experience to be an OPC fellow, to have the support of the network that I still have, and of the donor that I still have. And I think that extra time that I spent in the Balkans as part of that fellowship was very helpful for me, just to boost my regional knowledge, to be able to do something that I wouldn't have been able to do, as a young reporter without I don't know, without my own trust fund, I guess. So so that helped me quite a lot. And then I started for the New York Times in May of last year and finally moved to Moscow only in August, actually, not expecting to become or wanting to become a war correspondent. But, you know, already just a few months later, sort of the war drums began beating. And I remember we sat around a table in our bureau where the New York Times has operated for more than 100 years, actually, and discussed, you know, things are starting to look really bad. The troop buildup looks really bad. And we tried on our flak jackets, you know, thinking that, hoping that we wouldn't need to be using them. But then, you know, things started getting even worse. And on Valentine's Day, I was on a flight with that same flak jacket to Kyiv, where I spent, well, you know, where I was for the beginning of the war, which we all sort of realized the night before it happened was going to happen. And then I've spent,
How did you know? How did you know that was going to happen?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I actually, you know, in Kyiv, people did not expect it to happen. You know, even the day before, they were denying that this could ever happen. But I remembered, you know, the first place I ever worked as a journalist was Sarajevo. And all of my friends from Bosnia would say, you know, even as we watched the war beginning in Croatia, even as we saw nationalism growing ever more rampant in Serbia, and, you know, saw alarming signs here, nobody believed it could happen until it did. And that was always in the back of my mind, actually, while I was in Kyiv, you know, even as I was also hoping against hope that it was just hype. But, you know, the Putin speech, the Security Council meeting, the cyber attacks that all now seem actually like distant memories that were only about a month and a half ago. And then in the end, you know, the night before it happened, there was some intelligence going around that it would happen in the middle of the night, or before dawn broke. And, you know, I gathered some of my friends who hadn't heard that and sort of told them we all packed a little bag for ourselves, to, you know, all the essential items that we might need in case we lost communications, in case we couldn't find food, something like that. In the end, thankfully, it you know, the strike on Kyiv was quite drastic, but we were all safe and fine at that point.
What was the moment of greatest danger did you feel in your, altogether you were in Ukraine for a month, 6 weeks?
I think 6 or 7 weeks, and I'm going back. Actually, for me, the biggest danger was actually right before the war, right before the all-out escalation began. So I had actually gone on the 19th of February to the front line in the East. I mean, you know, most people really expected that if something really big were to happen, it would be happening in the East. So, you know, many of my colleagues had gone out there to base, and I embedded for a day with the Ukrainian military and with some politicians to go to the East, because before the attacks in Kyiv and Kharkiv and other cities began, there was sort of 2-3 days of like very intense, sustained, heavy shelling along the line of contact, which, you know, had been relatively, before that, kind of smoldering. You know, there might be an exchange of fire here and there, but it sort of began, I mean, exactly as American intelligence was saying it would, you know, possibly with an eye to provoking a false flag attack, or, you know, provoking the Ukrainians into responding. And I went to the town of Svitlodarsk, which is home to a very important chemical processing facility and energy plant. And David Arahamia, who is the faction leader in the Ukraine's parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, from Zelensky's party, organized just maybe a handful of journalists to go to a site. This was, I don't know, 2-3 in the afternoon. And we organized to go to a site that had been shelled at 11 a.m. that day. And we went there. It was just kind of a small military outpost, probably one of the closest to the other side, which was Horlivka, where like Russian troops were stationed there, and we sort of spent about 5-10 minutes interviewing the local station commander, talking to him about the casualties that were sustained. One of the men who was hit needed to have his arm amputated. My photographer colleague Lindsay Odario showed up, And then all of a sudden we just got this time to go, we need to get out of here. And I think pretty much just as we had packed into the car and pulled out, 3-4 seconds later, we could hear them lobbing mortars at us. They were very close to us. So so that was the first real brush that I had in this war. And I think the closest that I've come really to being in harm's way. And I mean, we were being driven by a soldier in the Ukrainian army who drove very well. He had spent 8 years actually on this part of the front and knew the road very potholed road very well. And he kind of just kept saying, everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine. Don't freak out. We're getting out of here. He was so calm. Yeah. And then we pulled into a kind of, I don't know, an outpost, maybe 1-2 kilometers away. And we waited for the shelling to stop and then we left. We went.
Sorry, Bill.
Oh no, I was just going to say that we went by bus to Kramatorsk, which is the city that today was shelled. The train station was shelled, killing, I don't know, at least 20-30 people who were trying to flee the city because the Ukrainian government ordered mass evacuation. Since now that the initial phase of Russia's operation failed to take Kyiv and some of these other cities, they seem to be regrouping towards the east, and that's.
Have you and other members of the press corps had hostile environment training? I know for their fellowship, you probably got a taste of it.
Actually, I had my first hostile environment training through RISK in Kosovo. Actually, Sebastian Younger had covered the Kosovo War, and he's been very committed. I think, and RISK was very committed to doing trainings for journalists from the Balkans. And I was lucky enough to be there and get a spot of somebody who had pulled out at the last minute. And then I did another one with the International Women's Media Foundation, and I was thinking of doing a refresher course and then in January, and then events sort of took over so quickly. I was planning to do another one for initially 1 week when I think there were some negotiations, Blinken-Lavrov, and then very shortly thereafter I went to Kazakhstan because of the unrest that broke out there. So I was quite immersed in what was happening there. And by the time I came back to Moscow from Kazakhstan with a nasty case of COVID, and by the time I was over the COVID, the war was building up quite substantially, and I was sent to Ukraine.
As a Slavic expert, what is your sense of the emotional historical dynamic between the Russians, or in this case Putin, and the Ukrainians? Can he walk away from this, or is he locked on an ideological and cultural mission, do or die? He must win something.
Yeah, I wish that I'd been in Moscow long enough to be inside Putin's head. I think even people who've been there for decades are not completely sure what's going on. He shares so little with so few people at this point. I do think, though, that it seems quite obvious that Putin feels like he needs to win something, and maybe that's going to be this corridor in the east, But the Russians have not even been able to take the port city of Mariupol, which is 25 miles from Russia's border. They've kind of laid siege to it for 43 days with substantially more significant soldiers than Mariupol has had to defend it. And they've, destroyed the entire city beyond recognition. And yet, they still haven't been able to take that. So, I mean, I think that Ukraine is very united, but I do think that Putin is going to, have to try to find a way to claim some kind of victory here. At the same time, almost every Ukrainian I speak to has friends and relatives in Russia who still really are not aware of the full extent of the war. So Putin has elements of his propaganda machine working very strongly in his favor, and they could maybe try to cast some of this as some, even a massive loss as a victory. But I don't expect the war to end anytime soon, unfortunately.
Wow. John, any other questions? We're taking.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what would you talked a little bit about Putin's mindset. What is the mindset of the Ukrainians that you're spending time with?
I think Ukrainians have never been more united. I think it's been fascinating to watch, especially as I've been reading books about Ukrainian identity and the cleavages between East and West. I think a lot of those are completely disappearing. I did a profile that was published today about Stanislav Asiyev, who was a journalist from a town near Donetsk and stayed there even after it was annexed by Russia-backed separatist forces. And, his story is one of so many people that I've spoken to, of people who are born, native Russian speakers, born very close to Russia, sympathetic with family and relatives there, reading Russian literature and, how do we say, being raised with a sort of a sense of history from the Russian perspective. And yet, having been now forced to flee their homes, having in Stanislav's case being terribly tortured by Russian separatists, or Russia-backed separatists, I should say, have completely rejected the concept of Russian, what it stands for. I mean, Stanislav and many other people I've spoken to, who didn't really learn Ukrainian at home or even properly in school, have stopped speaking Russian in exchange for Ukrainian. The same goes for many people from Mariupol that I've interviewed. And I interviewed one man maybe 2 weeks ago who had fled Mariupol. He was a wealthy businessman. He had an apartment in Crimea that he sold after it was annexed by Russia. And he had relatives who had invited him to stay in the Russian city of Bryansk. And he told me, he said to me, when I went to Crimea to sell his apartment, I felt a sense of shame and humiliation, pain and humiliation. And, if I went to these relatives in Russia who still don't really understand what's happening here, I would feel that pain and humiliation and shame. And, now I'm in Western Ukraine. I'm 58 years old. I don't really speak Ukrainian very well. I'm sad that I never learned it properly. But with me now here in Ukraine is only pain that will pass, and no humiliation, no degradation, and no shame. And I think that Ukrainians have very much coalesced around the values. It's much more about values and a worldview and a belief and a love in freedom than any kind of ethnic identity. I mean, half of these people I've mentioned are even considered, ethnically Russian. Their parents maybe came from Russia. So many of the Ukrainians that I've spoken to, the head of Ukraine's atomic energy company, I interviewed him after the nuclear power plant next to Zaporizhia was taken over. And this is somebody who was born in Russia, raised in Russia, finished all of his higher education in atomic energy in Russia, and moved to Zaporizhia to, help build the plant in Soviet times that the Russians are now trying to destroy, essentially taking over and destroying, And I mean, this is a man who moved to Ukraine as an adult, and he said, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, I'm Ukrainian. I'm not Russian, and it's been very powerful. This is something that many other people have observed in a much more eloquent way than I have, and over a much longer period than I have. But it has been incredibly powerful to see. I don't want to compare it to this American identity, but in some ways, it's really much more values and worldview based than any kind of ethnicity.
I have a last question.
For many people, especially, I should say, especially those in the East, I don't want to
last question.
Anything.
You wrote a piece about Mariupol. It was very graphic. While you were in Lviv, I think you were in the West. Are you able to do a lot of reporting on social media, or is it on telephone, or how are you able to get such graphic and compelling detail from a distance?
Thank you. Yes. I mean, unfortunately, it was really impossible to get into Mariupol, and it was very hard to find out what was going on because even, the city government, many of those officials are not inside the city, and they're getting information, from second and third hand sources. What I tried to do was find as many people as possible who had recently left, with incredibly graphic, incredibly fresh, incredibly painful memories. And I was speaking to them by video chat, by phone call, on Telegram, and I would speak to them, I would say probably for an hour and a half each person, and I think for them, everything was so fresh and had just happened, and they hadn't spoken to anybody besides the people around them about it. And, you know, these words and images sort of tumbled out of them.
Wow.
And I was very glad that they were able and willing to share their story with me. And I mean, many of the people that I spoke to said that this is very hard and very painful, but the world needs to know, because when you're sitting there in the basement, when you are huddled alone with no electricity, no contact with the outside world, you feel like you're abandoned, that nobody knows that you're there, you know, that it's almost as if you don't exist. And so it was very important to me to be able to put their stories on the front page of the New York Times and to tell them that we do very much care, and we do know you exist, and we want you to live and thrive.
Wow, how powerful. John,
That kind of reporting does bring change eventually.
Well,
John, we've had a lot of good material, John. Do you have one last question?
Well,
Very compelling, Valerie, just very, very moving. Thank you.
yeah. My only question is, are you taking care of yourself, and are your colleagues taking care of themselves?
well, I feel very, very blessed to, you know, be a full-time staffer at the New York Times and have my editors and people around us actually really caring and inquiring every day and having a very supportive community. You know, wars are often covered by a lot of freelancers. And, you know, when I was encouraged to take a break, other friends and colleagues of mine sort of said, well, that's nice for you. Like, I'm a freelancer. I can't do that. You know, just even logistically getting in and out of the country takes time and money. And so from that, you know, and the paper has been very supportive in terms of, you know, the editors calling to check in, especially after I had this incident with a mortar fire at the beginning, before the full-scale invasion started. Yes, I feel very blessed that the editors are checking in all the time and very genuinely concerned. And, you know, we have so many foreign correspondents in our network that can come in as well and replace colleagues who take a break or who leave, and then sort of get some rest and come back, because it was really, it's difficult to, yeah, I mean, you're working nonstop. There's so much more to cover than you can even cover in a day in a region. So I'm very grateful that they encouraged me to have a small break.
Wonderful, Valerie. Thank you so much. We'll make sure you get a copy of the presentation, and I'm personally very touched that you were willing to do this and be so articulate and so convincing.
Thank you.